Okay, Road to Revolution, Part 2. So the first part, we looked at the historical background to this, not only what was going on a little bit in the colonies, but even going further back to what was going on in England. Again, one question I kind of threw up in the first part is, asking first off, why did the colonists rebel when people back in England weren't rebelling, even though they were paying uh, much more taxes and a lot more governmental control? Also, why was it only the English that rebelled? Why didn't the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch, why didn't they rebel? And again, the short answer is, as far as why did the colonists rebel, was because they did have a lot of freedom. And in fact, for about 50 years, they had a lot of freedom that King George III tried to take back. That was a problem. And why the English over everybody else? Well, again, in part one, I try to go over that to show that there was a long tradition in Britain, not just in England, but also in Wales and Scotland as well, of rebelling against arbitrary power, that the colonists considered what they were doing not as something strange and unusual, but something really patriotic, something they were supposed to do. Now, today, I'm just going to look at the beginnings of this revolution. Again, keep in mind that at the start, I mean, they didn't know that this was the beginning of what was going to become a revolution. We see that today. Um, really, for most colonists, it wasn't until almost the last moment that they realized this is this is irreparable. This is actually a break from England. Nobody was thinking that in 1754, 1763, when we really begin this thing. So keep that in mind. No one at the time was thinking this is going to be revolution. Again, they were doing the same thing you and I are doing, making it up every day they go, because we don't know what tomorrow is going to be like. Life is an improvisation. It's easy to kind of go, oh, they did this because of that. Well, not always. And it does look like they really had no, anyway. Okay, so today we're just going to look at, for part two, the early events. So looking at the French and Indian War up through the Boston Massacre. So about 10 years. And then part three, as things start to really heat up, we'll spend a little more time from about 1773 through 1776, when we actually go full on to war and declare independence. Okay, so the first real step, even though there's previous stuff going back to English history, but in the immediate period, which really we date from 1763 to 1776, this 13-year breakup. But 1763, that was the end of this really major war. I mean, some people consider it the first truly global war, and that was the French and Indian War. And that's the way we refer to it, because for the colonists, that was the enemy, the French and their Catholic Indian allies. And then a little bit later, Spain will also be thrown into the mix on the side of the French and Indians. And, even though this was technically not a religious wars really kind of ended about 100 years earlier. At the same time, it really is very much a Protestant versus Catholic war. The Catholic Native Americans who converted under the French and Spanish, of course, joined with them. The either Protestant or non-Christian Native Americans sided with the English. So, by the way, unfortunately, I was so bad for this war. For those interested in military history, this is a major war, and it almost always gets skipped over, because it's usually just, we want to get to the end of it, because the end of it is what leads to the American Revolution. By the way, a quick note, France and England were constantly at war. I mean, they were the two enemies. And this is still a period where war was not done always for moral reasons or even about defense. War was often done to get land, to get goodies. And it was just almost constant warfare, almost every decade throughout the 1700s and into the 1800s. It is just constant war between these two countries. In some ways, the American Revolution is just yet another war between France and England. But this war was a bit bigger than previous ones. I mean, this one was unique in just the scale of it. What's interesting is that even though wars, including this one, have many, many reasons, one of the sparks for this war does seem to be an action by 22-year-old George Washington. He was the son of a tobacco planter in the colony of Virginia. He really wanted to go into the military, so he joined the Virginia militia. And in 1753, he sent out to the Ohio Valley Territory, which included sort of a disputed area between the French and the English. He was there to deliver some messages to the French, basically asking them to vacate the land. He was also there to spy a little bit. And he does deliver the message on his, there's a whole journal about this voyage and this journey and the troubles he faced. But then he returns with a relatively small group of soldiers and a Native American guide from a group sometimes known as the Ohio Seneca or the Ohio Iroquois, but the actual group was a group called the Mingo. And there's been several stories I've read. There seems to be some dispute over exactly what happened. I'll tell you one version of the story, and very likely this is not completely accurate, but this is the one that I've heard most often. And that is George Washington and his small group one night was on a hill. They look down and they see clearly a group of French soldiers sitting around a fire. Before they could decide what to do, the Native American, the Mingo Native American guide ran down the hill and immediately killed one of the French soldiers. Turned out to be a diplomat, a guy named Jumonville. Other stories say that basically George Washington is the one that attacked and fired. But either way, whatever exactly happened, there was a small battle, if you will. A diplomat named Jumonville was killed. The French considered this an act of war. There was another battle that was in retaliation, but ultimately, the French were able to use this as propaganda. It's like, look what the English did. They attacked us. We were not at war. They killed them, a diplomat, a man of peace. Obviously, England is the aggressor. And this little event actually did indeed kind of, along with some other things, snowball into this what became a global conflict. And this is just obviously a map I got offline, giving you a sense of the size of this war. So, where you see the slanted lines, you see obviously a lot of fighting in the colonies, which is mostly what we tend to focus on. But there's also plenty of fighting in Europe, but there's even fighting in Asia. And again, you can see all the different colonies that would have had a stake in this war. It could have gone a very different route. France, which had been the power up to this point. I mean, this is partly the beginning of the switch from France being the main power in Europe. It started out with Spain, then it's France, but this is the beginning of England emerging as the ultimate power. And of course, by the 19th century, they're going to be the largest empire ever in human history, a position they're pretty much going to hold until the 20th century. But it could have gone a very different route. Had France won, they would have controlled pretty much all of North America, and probably slowly over time would likely take it over what is now Mexico and stuff as well. Obviously, it didn't go that route. At the end of this war, the British Empire is quite large, even though they're going to eventually, as we know, they're going to lose the 13 colonies. But sometimes we Americans forget that by the time of the American Revolution, England already owned quite a bit of land. And of course, they're going to grow even larger after this. But for a brief period, they owned the Philippines. They were beginning to have a stake in India. This is when they get Canada. They get quite a bit of the land outside of the 13 colonies. This was a major, major victory for England, at least on paper, at least on maps. So again, you can see just how big their hold in North America actually was. But the problem was it left England broke. It's kind of like, you go out, you buy a nice house, you buy a nice car, you're really happy, you got all this cool stuff, but now you got to pay the bank. England had borrowed money from this. They had borrowed money from landowners in England. They had borrowed money from other countries, from banks, and now the government needs to start paying the bills. And plus, people do forget empires are expensive. You've got to maintain that empire. You've got to people it. You've got to maintain it. You got to have government. You got to have shipping routes. You got to have soldiers to protect it. You got to have correspondence and bureaucracy. It ain't cheap, right? So England's broke, and this is why this is such a big deal. As we said in part one, I compare the American Revolution to sort of a marriage. And why do relationships break up? And sometimes they break up because patterns change, and that leads to suspicion. This is the beginning of the pattern changing. This sets up the economic situation that then is going to lead to the taxes, that's going to lead to the suspicions, that's ultimately going to lead to the revolution. So that's really the big deal here. All right, so step two. So that lays out the ground, the groundwork for this. So the first real moment that there's a sign that there might be trouble, the first real change in the pattern is the proclamation of 1763. So for the colonists, I mean, again, they look at a map and they go, look at all this land we own. We used to just own, I don't know if you can see my little mouse here, but we used to just own this little bit here. Now we own all of this. And so, of course, the colonists are like, we've done all this fighting. We've suffered from this war and we came out victorious. We're going to get the spoils of this. We're going to get to move westward and get all this new land, and we're going to take over the land from the Indians that are there. Because keep in mind, this land isn't empty. Even though there's been a couple of centuries of warfare, and in particular diseases, we already know that Native Americans are very much have depopulated. They're not gone, of course. They're still here even today, obviously. And so this was not empty land, and that was a real concern by the British government. Again, they just emerged from this massive war. And this was just one of many wars that had been happening throughout the 1700s. This one had really taken a toll. And the last thing that England wanted was yet another war. Again, they've won, they got their land, now they got to take care of it. They got to settle their affairs, pay off some bills. So what they really want is a bit of a timeout. So they want the colonists to chill a little bit. Keep in mind, there weren't that many colonists at this point. Even the 13 colonies, if you just forget everything else, just the 13 colonies were still quite sparsely populated. There was plenty of land to go around. So what Britain did is they basically drew a line in the sand and said, okay, east of that line, of course, that's the colonies, you're fine, do whatever you need to do. West of that line, for now, not later, but for now, don't do anything. Because again, that was not empty. That was full of Native Americans. And many of those Native Americans were, obviously allies of the French, allies of the Spanish, enemies of England. And even those that may have fought with the English, to them, this was their land. And they don't want English incursion onto their land. If English colonists do that, what that's going to lead to is warfare. So that's the idea. And it does make logical sense. Now, just like any dispute, you always got to look at it from both sides. And so much of the revolution, what leads up to this is perspective. We Americans say, obviously we were right the whole time. But if you ask people in England, a lot of them will say, especially historians will say, no, actually, we were right a lot of the time. And again, a lot of it is perspective. So think about it from the colonist viewpoint. But before I do that, real quick, people in England were angry at the colonists. I mean, they were happy to get all this new land, but there was a sense with some in England that this shouldn't have happened. This only happened because the colonists were reckless. I mean, they're, like the story of George Washington. There was a sense of this. Oh, and I've realized I skipped over something that was written on the slide. Speaking of that, the other significance, and this plays a role, I think, in this as well, the other significance of the war is that during the war itself, there was a lot of tensions between the colonists, people like George Washington, and the English. If you think about it, all the colonists had their own local militia, for local disputes and attacks by Native Americans. And of course, they would be called up to war. Then you have the professional British Army, the Redcoats that come in. And so when the Redcoats came in, and they interacted and fought alongside the colonial militias, there was a class system there. It was very clear that the English soldiers very much saw themselves as above the colonists, that there was almost a two-tiered system. And there was a lot of, again, a lot of disputes. Yankee Doodle, I talk about this in the American Revolution lecture, but the song Yankee Doodle, which is a song making fun of the Americans, that was written during the French and Indian War by the British Army making fun of the colonists. And people like George Washington, as I've already said, most colonists were obviously not for revolution, even almost all the way up to the last moment. But a few, like George Washington, come out of this war done with England. I mean, they're still patriotic English people, but they have no use for England itself because of the way they were treated. So again, so people like George Washington felt of some of that tension even during the war. So then this happens. So from a colonial viewpoint, for somebody like George Washington, to them it's just an insult. But even other colonists, to them, it seemed as though the English government cares more about Indians than they do about their fellow Englishmen. It's not true. Again, this is just a logical thing to try to avoid future war and pay off some bills. But from the colonial viewpoint, somebody in Georgia, somebody in Pennsylvania, to them, it felt like an insult to them. That it was, and again, this is one of the first times, at least in 50 years, that the English government has done something to restrict the behavior of colonists. They're not used to this. So this is the husband coming home from work late for the first time. So what do the colonists do? They ignore it. They flout the law. They move westward. And guess what happens? A series of Indian uprisings. The British Army has to come in, quash those uprisings, and the British government decides, by the way, maybe we're just going to leave some of the British soldiers here permanently. And that's going to come back in a moment. That's going to be a big mistake on England's part. Number 3. Now, again, if anybody here, I know I got a couple of history majors in the fall 2020 here. I know some of you may go, hey, wait a minute, there's some other stuff that happened. And there are some other taxes that are passed. For instance, the big one is something known as the sugar tax. But I'm going to roll that all into one big one, and that's the Stamp Act. And even those who may not like history probably remember the Stamp Act. So act, of course, just means an act of parliament. So it's a tax that's simply known as the stamp tax. So why was this such a big deal? I remember hearing about this when I was in high school, and I remember thinking, just don't mail anything. But of course, it's not necessarily a stamp that you might think of. There were actual stamps, but there also were these stamps that were literally stamped a piece of paper. But what this basically is, when it was passed, it was a tax on documents, a tax on paper, a tax on licenses. I mean, we pay these today. You could get your wedding license, or somebody dies, you get a death certificate, or you get a deed for your house, or a car loan. You pay a tax. A lot of goods you buy, you're paying the gas tax. You're paying a little added tax on the price. And this is something that was quite common in England. People in England paid this. So why shouldn't the colonists, who are supposed to just be fellow Englishmen, who are supposed to be obeying the same laws, why should they also have to pay this? We're all in this together. We all owe the same money. We all got to chip in, especially considering colonists hadn't been paying a whole lot of taxes. So from a parliamentary viewpoint, even though some people, even before it was passed, were like, hey, this is a big deal for the colonists. You sure we want to go down this route? But for the majority, they thought, well, this is only fair. And you can make the argument that it was only fair. And it is weird, though. I mean, the tax did indeed sort of, it was on a lot of things. It did affect everybody. So again, whiskey bottles had a special label, playing cards, newspapers now had to pay this, court documents, things like that. So there was a major outcry on this. And by the way, this is when people started saying taxation without representation. That's when that term was being used. In fact, it's primarily during this event that is used. So this is what, I mean, this is one version of the stamps. I mean, sometimes they were literally stamps that would be affixed to a piece of paper. Sometimes the paper, this is a version, you can see it, this is affixed to a paper. Some of it was actually embossed. And some paper was vellum. It wasn't actual, paper like this. It was, and so you can't just stamp it. So they would often emboss a piece of paper, this blue piece. This is from the Smithsonian, by the way. This is a blue piece of paper. And then you affix that to the vellum. So there's several different forms it could take. There's also literally, again, a stamp that you would stamp some of the paper with. People love to point this out. It's one of the weird nuances of this. Another thing that was taxed was dice, and so you had to use this specially stamped dice. So some people also were upset because they thought this was almost like a moral tax to try to outlaw gambling by taxing playing cards and dice. And that's probably not completely wrong, that fear. So everyone kind of recognized, like in the colonies, was like, hey, we've never had to do this before. Why are we suddenly doing this now? But nobody said anything for a while. This was passed in March. Weeks went by. People didn't say anything. Finally, Virginia, the colony of Virginia, which was the first colony, the biggest colony, the most influential colony. Again, every colony had their own sort of legislature that dealt with local issues, right? In Virginia, it was known as the House of Burgesses. A burger, which goes back to Germany, means, Burg means a town. The burghers are the leaders of the town. So the House of Burgesses is basically, this is the grouping of all the town leaders throughout the state. So anyway, that's why I guess it's a weird name. So the House of Burgesses met. Most of the members had already gone home. It was the end of the session. There were only a few members left, and they were led by a guy named Patrick Henry. It's sort of like George Washington. Patrick Henry was quite a radical for his day. He was already kind of thinking maybe colonies should be independent. I mean, really out there compared to everybody else. So he sees this as an opportunity, and he's furious about this anyway. And so he begins to make an argument to the House of Burgesses. He says, look, this is an internal tax. This goes beyond the power of Parliament. Parliament's supposed to be dealing with broad national issues, not local issues, not marriages, not death certificates, gambling. This is stuff we can deal with, Now, of course, the way Parliament looks at it, they say, look, we're the national Parliament. There are no states here. This is not the United States. We're not a federal system. We're one national system. But the colonies say, no. Cities have always handled their own issues. London, Edinburgh, they've always kind of handled their own local issues. We're no different than them. Anyway, so they wrote up a document. The first version of it was way too radical. They had to rip it up and tear it up. Historians to this day don't know what the original document said. We just know they went really far. Ultimately, they wrote up a second resolution that just basically said, we think this is an unfair tax. We shouldn't have to pay it. This had never happened before. Basically, not just somebody, not just a newspaper, but an actual government in the colonies has risen up and said, we shouldn't have to pay this. And kind of like any group of people or even a classroom, sometimes, let's say a classroom, a teacher says something or does something inappropriate. Everyone looks around, nobody says anything. Finally, that one person raises their hand and says, I don't think that's right. And then all of a sudden, everybody else goes, yeah, me too, me too. So it takes that first person often to open the pathway for everybody else. And that's what happened. As Virginia did this, 8 other colonies issued similar resolutions. It actually got to the point, because again, the act wasn't supposed to take place, become effective until November. And even then you still had to wait for the stamps to actually arrive and get instructions. So it still had a while off before it was actually going to be implemented. And in fact, most colonies never ended up implementing it. There was even, however, a Stamp Act Congress. It wasn't that large. Unfortunately, the records of it were kept very sparse, and so historians really have very little idea of what actually took place in this. But it happened in New York City, actually in the City Hall of New York City, which ironically later becomes basically the head of the U.S. government in the 1790s. Anyway, it took place at City Hall. Several states were not a part of it: Virginia, New Hampshire, North Carolina, and Georgia. Keep in mind a quick bit about Georgia. I'm going to talk a bit more about Georgia in just a moment. Georgia is a brand new colony. In 1763, they have only been around 30 years. They're very sparsely populated. They're practically just Savannah, if you really come down to it. There's Savannah, a few little settlements. That's about it. The last thing Georgia wants to do is rock the boat. People in Georgia are just trying to make some money and get settled in. Unlike, say, Virginia, which has been around since 1607, they're in a very different position than Georgia. So Georgia is going to remain the most loyal colony all the way to the end of the American Revolution in 1783. They are going to remain, so this is not going to be, this is going to be a common thing, Georgia not being a part of. But don't mistake, people in Georgia were furious over the Stamp Act. Anyway, they met. This is when they issue official statements of this is taxation without representation. Again, back in England, they would say, well, the reality is most people aren't officially represented because most people don't have the property in order to have a representative to vote to get their representative in, but they're virtually represented. We're there for the good of everybody. And besides, there's a sense that you guys left England. You're way over there. You got all that other freedom. So anyway, so that's when that gone. And this really does shock you. They can't believe this. I mean, these guys are getting together. They're starting to organize a little bit. These colonies that usually competed with each other are now speaking with one voice. Now, admittedly, this is really a small group of people. And there's no talk of, pulling out guns and revolution. Today, we look back and go, wow, they're already organizing. But that's projecting what happens later onto this. Real quick, since we're in Georgia, Georgia does kind of have a unique history with this because officially Georgia was the only colony to actually get the stamps and even sold a few, not many, but they actually did sell a few of these. So it's the one place where this actually happened. So the governor of Georgia, it was a guy named George Wright. He was the royal governor really this entire period, all the way up until the Declaration of Independence came about. And he very quickly kind of put a quash on this. He said, guys, we're going to obey the rules. Deep down, he didn't really want to obey it. He kind of knew this was problematic, but he very quickly says, that's it. We're going to do what we have to do for this. However, in early November, in Savannah and a tavern, a group organizes. Now, in Boston, there's a group called the Sons of Liberty that organizes because of the Stamp Act. And they're going to remain all the way up until the Declaration of Independence. And, we've kind of romanticized them as patriots, but, these are vigilante groups. And that's one thing I do want to keep coming back to. And I'll talk even more about this in part 3 is, we've romanticized revolutions and we forget what revolutions really are. They're war, and they're wars that begin in the streets. Think about what's happening right now in 2020. People look in Seattle and Portland and, Charlottesville a couple of years ago, or, all over, in fact. And, regardless of which side you're on or, but think about how you might feel when you see looting or police brutality and you think, oh, come on, guys, obey the rules. So let's calm down. I mean, that's politics of the street, and it's scary. And it can get violent very quickly. And keep in mind, that is a revolution. And a group like the Sons of Liberty are doing politics of the street. And we do begin to see some of that during the Stamp Act crisis. So anyway, an offshoot of the Sons of Liberty. In fact, they actually sometimes called themselves that, but their most common name is Liberty Boys. They form in Savannah. In fact, there were several hundred. And a couple of times they threatened violence. And in early December, they did a mock hanging where one of them was pretending to be hung, and in his hand was some fake stamps. And basically it was like, if the stamp master, the person that's in charge of collecting this tax, and it was a guy named George Angus, in fact, who arrived in December, basically said, if you do your job, we might be doing this to you. And in fact, in January, a group of the Liberty Boys directly faced off with the governor, and there was a tense face-off there. Ultimately, the governor ended up hiding the stamps on an island near Savannah. And then, like, fortunately for him, by the following March of 1766, pretty much it was over with. But even the Georgia newspaper, they only had one in the colony of Georgia. The Georgia Gazette refused to print during this period because they didn't want to pay the tax. So anyway, so with the Virginia resolves and the Stamp Act Congress and you know the sporadic violence they're seeing, the Parliament does back off, which again is surprising. In fact, how often Britain does back off these issues. But they do something very interesting. And I think anybody who's a parent, anybody who's ever been a boss, even as a teacher, I think I can sympathize a little bit. When you're in a position of authority, again, I'm a parent. I used to be a park ranger. I had to enforce rules. Again, as a teacher, you have to enforce some rules. And of course, I do the grading. You have to be careful of not giving up too much power in any position you're in. You know, if you're a parent and, you know, your kid does something that they're not supposed to do, and you say, all right, well, next time you do that, you're in trouble. Then they do it again. All right, next. After a while, they're like, you just always say that. In fact, the story I always tell is of one time, my parents weren't spankers because they got spanked hard, so they didn't spank me hard. They just thought, well, there's other ways to punish. But the one time I remember getting spanked was near my house. A creek got flooded. My mom said, don't go swimming in there. I said, okay. And I meant it. But then all my friends went swimming, so I went swimming. I was nine years old at the time. And I remember my mom, who was not in great shape. She was a large woman, and she came down the hill. And I saw her, and I was like, oh my God, I'm in trouble. And sure enough, she yelled at me, and we were walking back to our house, and she had embarrassed me in front of my friends, and she felt bad. And she said, all right, don't ever do that again. But because if you do it again, you're going to get a spanking, but you won't this time. And I was mad. And I just said, you always say that. And it is true, because she never spanked me. And I said, you always say that. That was a bad mistake. Because I was headed in my room, but before I got there, she was already there with a belt. Now, it really didn't hurt. It was kind of pathetic, but it scared the hell out of me because she never spanked me. And the reason, I mean, she and I even talked about this many years later, the reason she did that was because I called her out. I threatened her power. And she knew I was right. She did always say that. That's why sometimes when you're a kid, you get in more trouble when you're doing something away from home in front of people, because something you can get away with in front of your parents at home, but in front of other people you can't, is because it makes them look weak when you don't obey them. So Parliament has to actually worry about it, especially considering the colonies are thousands of miles away. If England kind of realizes the colonies really, really, really don't want to obey the rules, there's not a whole lot England can do other than go to war, which nobody wants that. So they have to assert their authority quickly, or they're losing. They recognize it, so they're repealing this rule. Basically, colonies are acting up. They repeal the rule, so they issue an act saying, we have the right to do this. We are declaring, we're reminding you that you're just a colony. We are Parliament. You are subject to our rule. This is and so it is kind of like the parent going, next time, buddy, you're going to obey. Now, by the way, England does listen to the colonies. There's internal debates in Parliament about what colonists are saying. And they're going to try, believe it or not, they're actually going to try to listen to the colonies. Okay, so the Quarterneck. This is kind of around the same time. This is another act to try to cut costs. So as I said earlier, with the proclamation of 1763, they bring in British soldiers to permanently, not many, but permanently keep them there. That in itself is a problem. Imagine if we were face to face, and I walked in one day, and I came in with 4 police officers, and I made them stand in the 4 corners of the room, just staring at you. They got guns, billy clubs, tasers, tear gas. They don't use them, but they're just looking at you. There's the threat of violence. You guys would be furious at me. You would be nervous. You would wonder what's going on, but you would also feel like, I clearly don't trust you. And I am basically, by having them there, I am kind of threatening violence. This doesn't happen to me much anymore because I'm old. But when I was younger, I can remember going to, especially as I was with friends of mine, and we were laughing and walking around the store, and we might, pick up something we're going to buy. And let's say it's really expensive. I can remember, the store clerk just watching us the whole time. Hey, Are you going to buy that? I could put it on the counter for you. Because they clearly thought we were going to shoplift. And I know people of color. In fact, I worked at a store where my boss, anytime an African-American came in, always made us watch them closely. Which, oh my God, terrible. So I know some of you listening go like, oh yeah, I've been through that. And you do, you feel angry because, because you're being distrusted. And so that's how colonists felt. But here's what really made people angry is, again, because they're trying to cut budgets and find ways to cut costs, they said, okay, because these soldiers are here for your protection. But by the way, they're also here because of the Stamp Act and some of the fact that colonists are clearly beginning to disobey the law. So there is that as well. Anyway, because they're here for your protection, colonists need to start paying for them to be there, housing them, feeding them, not in your private home now, but just in general that the colonists, the legislatures need to pay for this. It makes sense from a budgetary viewpoint, but it's another change in the pattern, something they never had to do before. Now they have to do it. And on top of that, it seems to be a sign that England no longer trusts the colonists, which is starting to be true. Colonists are furious about this. And just the presence of the soldiers are going to cause some tensions over the next several years. But New York, in particular, had the absolute worst protests. So, Stamp Act didn't work. Colonists do have to pay taxes now. I mean, they can't just get away with not paying the taxes. And they have gotten away with very little taxes for 50 years. I mean, that is a fact. And there's a lot of anger in England that suddenly the Stamp Act got repealed. Even though even people who said that maybe we didn't do it right still say they got to do something. So a guy named Charles Townshend, he's the exchequer. We would call him a treasurer, the money guy and the government. Charles Townshend comes up with a series of laws that Parliament passes, and they're known as the Townshenex. And so, again, one of the complaints about the Stamp Act was that it was an internal tax and that it should have been an external tax. In other words, things that are happening within the colony should deal with. Only the things that come from the outside should be what Parliament deals with. So Townshend said, okay, gotcha. So what they passed was several things, but the main thing was this is a tax, but this is a tax on imports coming from England into the colonies, which is about as external as it gets. Before I even finish, colonists don't like this either. The reality is they don't want to pay any damn taxes. So, it's just like Congress today. They'll say one thing, and then the next year, the opposite happens, and they go, "Oh, well, actually, the reality is we don't." So same thing here. The reality is they just don't want to pay any taxes. They don't think they should have to pay these taxes. But on top of that, this new tax, it's the money raised by this tax is now going to be used to pay for the royal governors, like, say, Governor Wright of Georgia. Now, the royal governors, which means their money came from the king's coffers. Now they're saying, oh, no, since they're colonial governors, you guys need to pay for them, just like you need to pay for the housing of the soldiers. Yet another change in the pattern. Suspicions are rising. On top of all of this, and this is, I would say, the first big major screw up on England's part. And that is because New York was so outspoken with the Stamp Act. I mean, that's what the Stamp Act Congress happened. They also were the ones that absolutely refused to obey the Quarterneck. There was a lot of outbursts there. The legislature there seemed to do nothing to stop it. So part of the Townshenex, they shut down the legislature in New York, in the colony of New York, temporarily. Don't get me wrong, it's temporary. But if the argument is we don't have a voice in the Parliament, the last thing you want to do is shut down what little voice the people have at all. And that's kind of what happens in New York. It just plays right into the fears. The response to this was a non-importation movement. In other words, if there's a tax on imports, we're going to quit importing stuff. So a lot of people in the colonies are basically saying, let's buy local. But just like today, people say, let's buy local, don't go to Walmart, don't go to Target, don't buy American-made stuff. That's always easy to say. You can put a bumper sticker on your car. But then when it's time to go buy stuff, we go with what's cheapest and what we like. We all do that. No matter what we say publicly, we all buy whatever is cheapest and what we really want. And so anyway, same thing here. So while importer became an ugly word, stores that sold imports, there would be graffiti on them. One time I said that, and students like, graffiti, and like, you don't realize graffiti goes back to the classical era. There's always been graffiti. So they would paint graffiti on the stores. They would attack store owners for selling imports. But if you're a store owner, you know, you got to sell the imports, the stuff coming from England, because that's the good stuff. All that locally made stuff, yuck. So if you want to stay in business, you had to import stuff. And again, keep in mind, as I said on the first part, throughout all of this, colonies were not all the same. Colonists had very different opinions. Some just said, let's just pay the tax, everybody. Come on, shut up and just obey the rules. Just like today, you know, when there's protests today, there's always several sides to it, right? But it does start to get really ugly. This is when the violence, the politics of the street is really starting to kick up and ramp up. The famous story is in Boston. Boston, from this point on, Boston starts to become the center of all of the conflicts. So there was a store owner in Boston who was selling imports, and he was the target of a lot of protests, graffitis, and threats to his life. One evening, there was about 500 people in front of the store, yelling, screaming. The store owner locks up, goes outside, walks to his house. The crowd follows. Now think about this, if this was you and you're literally going to your home and there's a whole hundreds of people following you, yelling at you, screaming at you. He goes to his house where his wife and kids are, goes inside. The crowd stays. They're getting bigger, more threatening. Finally, and I'm gonna cuss a little bit, so apologize in advance. So finally, after a while, a rock is thrown through the window. It almost hits one of the kids. On top of that, somebody yells, "Come out, you goddamn son of a bitch, or we're gonna kill you." I mean, this is a legitimate threat to the life of himself and his family. So the guy grabs a gun, opens the front door, and fires a warning shot over the heads. Now, by the way, if you have a gun, never do this. Just like never shoot a gun in the air like they do in the movies, and never shoot a warning shot, because bullets go up and then bullets come down. And a bullet came down and it killed a 10-year-old kid named Christopher Snyder, who is sometimes considered the first martyr of the American Revolution. Now, the kid was just a 10-year-old who just happened to be in the crowd. Ultimately, the store owner was found not guilty for the murder of the kid, because he obviously didn't do it on purpose. He was trying to defend his life. And that night, the crowd dispersed, but the story of this spread and grew. So imagine if you're in Savannah, Georgia. You don't know what actually happened. All you hear is some no good importer killed the kid. And again, think about even today with the internet. In fact, it might be worse with the internet. And you know, something happens in LA, but we hear about it, something very different. And you know, same thing here. So this is happening. It's getting the violence is getting scarier. It's ramping up. And ultimately, it explodes with something we call the Boston Massacre. Again, the anger, we're talking 7 years now of anger. There's conspiracy theories about the British government. There's soldiers here. There's groups organizing like the Sons of Liberty and the Liberty Boys. It was a matter of time before this all exploded as a powder keg. And that happened in Boston. So at this point, actually, I'll leave it on the slide. This is a modern day image of where this took place. What I'd like you to do is pause, go to listen to me, then pause, go to content, and you will see, it says links supporting videos. And there's several clips from an HBO show that came out several years ago called John Adams. It's actually quite good. It is Hollywood. Not everything's completely accurate in it, but it is quite good. And it's quite good for a couple of reasons. One, it is much more accurate than many shows are. Two, there's so few movies or TV shows about the American Revolution. It's really crazy how little we make about this. In fact, I always ask students, can you name a movie about the American Revolution? And the one that almost always comes up is The Patriot, which is a fine film. It's horrible history, but you know, it's a crazy Mel Gibson's in it, and it's 20 years old on top of that. There's a few others, but there's not many. And the other reason I like this show is because it's about the forgotten founding fathers. It's so funny. People, I think I've said this in part one, people always talk about the founding fathers. Then you ask somebody to name them, and very quickly they're like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, John Adams, James Madison. I'm out. You know, there's 50 of, was it 54 of these guys, and so yet, actually, it's more than that when you include the Constitution, and most of us can name 4 or 5. And John Adams is one of the few that is one of those that even many can't name him. He's not on any of our money. There's no statues to him. He's kind of the forgotten founding father. Yet he was the first vice president, second president. He helped write the Declaration of Independence. Incredibly important, completely forgotten about by many, many people. Anyway, it has the first episode in it deals with the Boston Massacre. And there's a couple of scenes from it. So if you don't mind, watch that. I think it's 3 clips and then we'll talk. So I'm going to assume you watched them. Probably didn't, but hopefully you did. So very quickly, as you kind of get from those clips, the Boston Massacre really wasn't a massacre. It was a tragic accident. There had already been a lot of scuffles between young, mostly men in Boston and these soldiers. One night, it just got out of hand. Somebody threw a rock while they were also yelling, "Shoot, I dare you, fire, I dare you." So the rock hit one of the soldiers, the gun went off, a couple other soldiers quickly fired. The officer said, "Stop firing," but unfortunately several people were killed in that. And if you watch all the clips, you'll see there is a court trial. John Adams, this is actually how he first becomes famous, is the lawyer for the soldiers. He actually, even though he hated them being there, he was very anti all of this, but yet he still believed in the law. And he believed that everybody deserves a fair trial. And in the movie, everybody gets off. But in real life, the soldiers were found not guilty, but the officer was found guilty of negligence. Basically, the argument was he shouldn't have let it get out of hand like this. But what you also get from those clips is the, if you will, the propaganda aspect of this. This is the famous drawing that you already see. And then go back to this photograph I took in 2008. So right in front of this building is where the Boston Massacre actually happened. In fact, you can see that's the same building there. But this drawing was done by a guy named Paul Revere. You can see his name towards the bottom there. He was a silversmith. He also did a lot of artwork for publishers. And he did this for Samuel Adams. And Samuel Adams is in 2 of the clips. He's the guy that walks up yelling, "You'll pay for this." He's actually the cousin of John Adams. John Adams was kind of a nobody. He was from out of town. He just moved to Boston. Samuel Adams was the big player. He was, for anybody knows anything about beer, you probably have heard of Sam Adams beer. The beer you can get today, which I hate Sam Adams beer. But anyway, the beer you can get today, it comes from Boston, but it's not actually Sam Adams' beer. But Sam Adams did actually make beer. He was a lawyer, he was a publisher, he edited a newspaper, and he was a local politician, and ultimately signed the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. He is a very important person, but he was also a radical. He was part of the Sons of Liberty. He and Paul Revere both participated quite a bit of some of the violent acts. But like George Washington, like Patrick Henry, early on, he was one of those that was like, yeah, we need to break away from England. So anything that happened that could help push that forward. Basically, I guess in modern, they were influencers. You know, they were trying to influence the attitude. And Sam Adams was in the position to do that. So very quickly, he gets Paul Revere to do this drawing. It's published in newspapers. It's published as posters. It's sent all over the colonies. Initially, it was called the Bloody Massacre. Later becomes known as the Boston Massacre. Again, that's Sam Adams's terms. And you can see this image. I mean, it shows soldiers absolutely firing, blood gushing out of people's heads. Although the dog always makes me laugh. And there are huge repercussions to this. They briefly showed this in the clip, but this painting done based on Revere's drawing shows a guy named Crispus Attucks, the African-American gentleman who was a free African-American in Boston, probably about 41 years old. We think he was the first one shot and killed. Anyway, so some people claim he's the first person killed in battle in the American Revolution. Anyhow, based on the event, but also the naming of it, Boston Massacre, and the pushing of it. This had massive repercussions back in England, and then would continue to have repercussions throughout the 1770s. But that would be part 3. All right, guys. I'll talk to you guys later. Again, hopefully you watch the clips, and I'll see you in part 3. Thank you.